Boste mi povedali, ko bo, ne? Odlično. Spoštovani, lepo pozdravljeni na 4. simpoziju ICOMOS Slovenija. To je znanstveni simpozij, ki se letos sredotoča na temo odpornostne dediščine. Simpoziju smo dali naslov Dediščina, ki kljubuje. Simpozij bo potekal v angleškem jeziku, vendar imate vsi, ki želite poslušati simpozij v slovenščini, na voljo 2 kanala. Tehnična navodila so bila podana. Tudi jaz bom naprej govorila v angleščini. Če boste imeli kakšne težave glede tehnike, se prosim obrnite na naslove, ki smo jih objavili. Zdaj bo pa še moja kolegica Anja Vinter, naša sekretarka, podala temeljne tehnične usmeritve v angleškem jeziku. Tako da, Anja, prosim.
Pozdravljeni, welcome. We would kindly ask you to take care of your microphones and your cameras. For better streaming, it is better if the cameras are off. You are welcome to write any kind of questions you may have into the chat box, and we will ask them later on. If the presenters will not answer by themselves, we will ask them later on in the discussion slot. So enjoy the conference.
Hvala, Anja. Thank you, Anja. Dear participants and guests, distinguished honorable speakers, Professor Dr. Regine Alatalu, Vice President of ICOMOS International and President of ICOMOS Europe, Professor Dr. Maja Zalaznik, Vice President of the Slovenian National Commission for UNESCO, dear Dr. Marlis Ogeltorf, President of Organization TIKI, esteemed representatives of our supporters and co-organizers, Director General of the Cultural Heritage Directorate of the Ministry of Culture, Dr. Jelka Pirkovič, Director of the Institute for the Protection of Cultural Heritage of Slovenia, Mr. Jernej Hudolin. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 4th International Scientific Symposium of the ICOMOS Slovenia. This year's symposium topic is resilient heritage. There are many reasons why we selected these topics, as we are all increasingly aware of our impacts on nature and have started feeling the consequences of our actions in past on a daily basis. If I mention just the recent Hurricane Ida in the United States, or the severe floodings and storms in Germany and Belgium at the beginning of this summer. It is time to accept the consequences responsible and to do everything in our power to prevent them in the future. The COVID-19 pandemic crisis additionally underscored the gravity of the situation. The necessity of committing to the principles of sustainable development and adopting the measures to mitigate the consequences is more relevant now than ever before. The Paris Agreement of 2015 specified the goals and measures for the reduction of the consequences of severe global warming by 2030. However, these have not been implemented in the envisioned scope. Therefore, trying to find a way to successfully respond to climate change is one of the most crucial tasks for all of us. Cultural heritage, with its sustainable dimension, can play an important role in this regard. The traditional building practices are teaching us how to design sustainable on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are developing new methods for reuse and recycling heritage buildings without program instead of demolishing them. For example, industrial heritage and recent structures are here the topics. It is therefore crucial to preserve the heritage and to improve its resilience. This year's symposium has been divided into 3 main topics. The first one is what is the situation and how prepared are we? The second will highlight the key challenges. while the third, titled Cultural Heritage as an Example, will discuss what we can learn from cultural heritage to ensure a more sustainable, tenable, and nature-friendly life. In the introductory lecture today, the general issues will be presented by Andrew Potts, one of the world's foremost experts on the topic of heritage and climate change. Thank you very much, Andrew, for being with us today. I would also like to thank all the keynote lecturers and chairs of the thematic sessions, Dr. Sandra Fatoric from TU Delft, Professor Dr. Rohit Jigyasu, Project Manager at ICROM and Vice President of ICOMOS Corp, and Professor Dr. Roko Žarnič, President of the Slovenian Association of Earthquake Engineering and Professor of our university. Let me also thank the Slovenian National Commission for UNESCO, under whose honorary patronage this symposium is taking place, and the Ministry of Culture, which found us as a non-governmental organization in the public interest. The symposium is also included in a companion program of the Slovenian presidency of the Council of the EU. However, most of all, let me thank you, distinguished presenters, who have prepared your papers for this symposium. Altogether, you will hear 26 presentations from 17 countries. I hope that the exchange will be effective and the debates lively. Enjoy the program and gathering, although this year virtual for majority. Thank you very much. At the end of my speech, I have to apologize our Dean, Professor Matej Blenkuš. He cannot be with us today due to some unexpected personal reasons, but he wishes us all good work and all the best for the symposium. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Jernej Hudolin, Director of the Institute for the Heritage Protection. He is also our co-organizer, to welcome all of you. So, Jernej.
Dear guests, organizers and colleagues, allow me to warmly thank the organizers of this important symposium for giving me the privilege of welcoming and addressing you all in person and virtually. I'm sincerely delighted that we have been able to meet up in such numbers at the 4th International Symposium in cooperation with ICOMOS and our institute with the support of the Faculty of Architecture and Ministry of Culture. I'm particularly pleased to see such a positive response from speakers and to see with us today and in next days prominent experts in a wide variety of fields, yet all with shared experience of trying to contribute to the preservation of cultural heritage. This year's title, Resilient Heritage, is very telling, and it addresses heritage that withstands not just time, but also climate change, and calls on us to ponder. Uncontrollable climate change is one of the greatest threats to cultural heritage and something that conservators and restorers are facing in our everyday work. In facing climate change and its impacts on cultural heritage, we are all aided by a variety of conventions and other documents and broad initiatives or appeals that are already in place, such as Paris Agreement, yet that is priceless is your view and direct experience in dealing with this issue, along with a common search to solution and possibilities for preserving cultural heritage for further generations. I wish you every success in this symposium, and I believe that in bringing together our strength, we can take a step forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jernej. Our next speaker is Dr. Jelka Pirkovič, Director, General Cultural Heritage Directorate, Ministry of Culture. I hope, Jelka, you are with us.
Yes, here I am. Do you hear me?
We just don't hear you.
I have my mic on.
Sorry, Jelka, we don't hear you. This is a small technical issue. A ste slišali? Ste videli, kaj je napisal? Oni slišijo. Samo mi je.
Do you hear me now? I am unmuted.
Thank you.
Yes. I believe that the difficulty was because I was muted by the host.
Yeah.
In any case, it's nice to be with you. And as Sonja already told, this symposium is also one of the co-program in our presidency. This is it is important issue from the point of view of the Ministry of Culture, and I want to thank ICOMOS Slovenia for organizing this important symposium, and I also am very happy to see all old friends from ICOMOS and from elsewhere around this virtual table. So, as you know, Slovenia already had one of the major conferences in the framework of our presidency last week, really, on Friday and Saturday. The topic of this conference was, I believe, connected to your topic, because we dealt with heritage rights and its importance for the sustainable development. So, participatory approach is one of the mechanisms, I believe, that can foster also a better coping with climate change and other risk factors that threaten our heritage. So let me explain briefly what was the result of our conference from last week. The aim really was to show the connection between participation of wider public and especially heritage communities in all activities related to heritage, and its in this way to improve the sustainable development. We had a very open dialogue about these topics, divided into panels and also 3 workshops. One of the workshops was extremely interesting to my mind. That's my personal impression. dealing with difficult heritage. And also in this way, I believe the difficulties that our professionals meet can be better solved when having a larger public on our side. So heritage was also stressed as a highly important issue in quality of our living environment, because we are convinced that heritage shows the way how sustainability can be achieved not only through new technologies and new ways of coping, but also of following the positive example that heritage can bring us. And the final message of our conference was that Europe needs heritage as a kind of a humanistic agenda for the future. But I can say that if we see it in more general terms, not only addressed to European institutions and European audience, but at the global level, I can say that our message was heritage should become our ethical agenda, since it is a reflection of our deep human nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelka, for presenting also the outcomes of the very important conference held last week. Now I am asking to join us, dear friend, our guest, Dr. Miles Ogleshoff, President of organization TICI, the International Committee for the Conservation of Industrial Heritage. Miles, are you with us?
Hello, Sonja, yes, I'm with you.
Yeah, perfect. So, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm both delighted and very honored to have this opportunity to greet you all at the start of this really exciting fourth Symposium of ICOMOS Slovenia. I'm doing so as president of TICI, the International Committee for the Conservation of the Industrial Heritage. And you have a magnificent program ahead of you over the next few days. TICI has had a formal relationship, a partnership with ICOMOS since 2000, when an agreement was signed in London, and that was reinforced by the Dublin Principles 11 years later. So it's a very special and close relationship. And I'm really pleased to be doing this as well, because I greatly value the friendship and expertise of our colleagues and members in Slovenia. You have a very rich industrial heritage here, and you have one of the most ambitious World Heritage Sites, the Mercury Mine at Idrija, which was inscribed onto the World Heritage List in 2012, along with its partner site, Almaden in Spain. And obviously industrial heritage features in this program, which is tremendous. And the theme of this symposium, Resilient Heritage, couldn't be more important. Those of you that know me know that my day job is Head of Industrial Heritage at Historic Environment Scotland, which is based in Edinburgh. And you will not be surprised to know that our thoughts are currently turning to how we can make a positive contribution to COP26 when it happens in November in Glasgow. And this is difficult for a number of reasons, but one of them is to try to penetrate the event with culture and the built heritage in particular. And we have an initiative called Culture at COP that's trying to do that. And I think one of the great things that we have at Historic Environment Scotland going for us is our climate action plan and the overarching aim, which is, and I quote, to turn our cultural heritage from a victim of climate change into a catalyst for climate action. And as Sonja hinted at the beginning, industrial heritage is especially well placed to take on this challenge. There's so much that we can do in the way of imaginative, adaptive reuse, firing sustainable development, encouraging placemaking and responsible consumption and responsible tourism, which needs to be at the heart of the way we manage our culture in the future. We need to put our industrial heritage at the core of education so that we can fight the evils of uncritical, passive mass consumption and induce a respect for the material world around us. So with these thoughts in mind, I congratulate ICOMOS Slovenia on organizing such an inspiring conference and wish you well during the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mars. Thank you for this encouraging word. Now I would ask to join me here in Ljubljana, Professor Maja Zalaznik, I'm very sorry, Vice President of the Slovenian National Commission for UNESCO, who is also our honorable patronate. So please, Maja.
Thank you. Well, respected organizers, Professor Ifko and the team, I'm really glad that I can stand in front of you today because the hybrid way of organizing events, it's not so simple in these days. So I congratulate you for that. First of all, thank you for this kind invitation to address you on this important topic and to share some thoughts about the cultural and general heritage on behalf of Slovenian National Commission for UNESCO. Unfortunately, our president cannot be today with us, so just allow me a few words and my thoughts about what heritage really means to me, to us, to UNESCO, and to supporters of such events, even in the future. I was, still am a member of the high-level reflection group of UNESCO for strategic transformation. And I've been listening and I heard many cases, sad cases, but also very successful cases of prevention or protection of heritage. Lots of analysis, lots of also thoughts and concerns about how to tackle in each country all this heritage we are confronting, but at the same time, we know how much of importance it is to keep it, preserve it, and of course, use it in the right social and humanic way. And the thoughts I shared to my members of the group, to our members of the group, were mostly dedicated to the young generation, because I think that where we are really obliged in this world is to give young generation the really protected heritage in all senses, which means that we can give them something to learn out of, to see the identity, to feel the history, but at the same time, give them this heritage also to economically prosper, because we can combine both sides, and we can, and cases really around the world, also in Slovenia, show that this is possible. So I think that this year's topic of ICOMOS is really addressing us in the right way, being resilient. Being resilient in the COVID times is even more important word, because we know that lots of museums, institutions, open spots of heritage have been actually closed, and people could not attend either performances or exhibitions or just saw them. So it is important that we talk about this loudly and that we are not neglecting that so much heritage has been just somewhere there, but even in a health crisis, it is still here. It is here, and we have to protect it, and we have to see it and help the experts to work further, to develop their understanding of how to protect and how to develop the heritage for the future. So what I see here is heritage is one of our one of the most important social pillars, and social cohesion, sustainable development needs to tackle it step by step with a wise understanding of what everything brings to the world, to the society, to us people, and as I said from the beginning, especially to young generation. So I think that our message here and your message here, it couldn't be more right. But at some point, we need to address ourselves as people, as human beings, how important it is that we see the protected, the preserved heritage, not only in the right expert way, but also in a human way, being acceptable and also adapted for many generations and for future generations. And at the same time, to somehow support the heritage today, to find the other ways. And I saw the cases right now, speaking about the museums and speaking about some open spots, how the COVID situation brought also the opportunity for it with technology, with digital era. How to bring closer to the people by using the technology, also the heritage issues. And I think that we can address today both sides of this world. So the physical part and the technology digital part. And I'm sure that the keynote speakers will address this too. So if I may conclude on behalf of the National Commission of UNESCO Slovenia, I'm sure that this symposium, and together with all the expert support and together with all our responsibility, we can bring on and on, not only the topics themselves, but also try to guide also the experts, the generals, the community, and of course the decision makers, that we need to step together to preserve, protect, and develop the heritage in all senses. Not only because just to have them there, but to use them also for the future and for its development. And thank you to the organizers, the fourth time this year. I think that what truly matters in such assembly is that we talk about the society and its values. And I hear all this. So thank you for being invited, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to patronize this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Zalaznik, for this really kind and orientated to the community speech. That's the most important. We preserve heritage not just for ourselves, experts, but for the future. Heritage belongs to all of us. That's very important message. So our next speaker, she will conclude, and together with Professor Zalaznik, open our symposium. President of ICOMOS Europe, Vice President of ICOMOS International, Rin Alatalu. Rin, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Sonja, nice to see you.
Nice to
And
see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes.
So, the floor is yours.
It is a pleasure for me to be with you and greet you on this event, and taking up what the last speaker said. It is important to talk about social and community issues, but it's also most important it is to talk. And I think this is one of the ICOMOS challenges, to bring the themes up and keep them on the podium for the others. ICOMOS International, the national committees internationally work very differently, and we also have differences between European committees. And it is my pleasure to notice that ICOMOS Slovenia is so active, so intensive. I think the very good proof to it is also the fact that I visited last week Slovenia to participate on the conference on right to heritage as a catalyst for sustainable development. And it's now the second week you have another conference. And I think it's not just that you are active in using different possibilities to bring heritage issues up, but also that you have the courage. I highly commend you on having heritage topics so highly visible in the presidency of Slovenia in EU. I think I will, and not just these two conferences this week, but I must say that ICOMOS Slovenia is much more visible than many other committees in Europe in the ICOMOS international work. And I really thank you for that, and I hope that we can keep up our good cooperation. So thank you, and let's enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Reen. Thank you very much, all speakers. So our next guest, the highlight of today, Andrew Potts. Andrew, are you with us?
Yes, happy to be here.
Yeah, Andrew, very welcome. Oh, nice to see you. We were in contact many times over the mails recently, but that's perfect that we are now all together here at our symposium. Andrew, I will just introduce you shortly, and then I will give you a floor for your lecture. Okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Andrew Potts coordinates the Secretariat of the Climate Heritage Network on the behalf of ICOMOS. The Climate Heritage Network is a very important organization which connects around the world those who share the commitment role to art, culture, and heritage, which can play in tackling of climate changes. That's in tackling the climate emergency and issues related to the climate changes, of course. Andrew also coordinated the ICOMOS Climate Change and Heritage Working Group until recently. It was formed in 2017 to mobilize the cultural heritage community to help meet the challenges of the heritage and climate change. In July 2019, under the leadership of Andrew, the working group released the report, which is a very important document on the field, The Future of Our Past, Engaging Cultural Heritage in Climate Actions. Report scoped hundreds of ways in which cultural heritage can drive transformative climate action and present the numerous impacts climate change is having on every type of heritage. Andrew will for sure present today how to confront them effectively. So Andrew, floor is yours for the introductory lecture.
Well, thank you, Sonja, Professor Ifko, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for having me here today. I'm speaking to you today from Moderna in Turkey. Normally I would be in the United States, in New York, where I live, but I've been in Turkey all this past week for meetings about the role of cultural heritage in climate resilient sustainable development. And so the topic of today has been very much on my mind these days. But by the way, in Moderna, I've had a good introduction to their iconic historic wood architecture and the role it can play in regeneration. And I think maybe you can see a little bit of that famous architecture behind me. So I've been asked to speak for about an hour. So it's a good length, so please be comfortable, get comfortable while I talk. I've been asked to speak about the topic building resilience, cultural heritage, and the planetary emergency. So it's a big topic, and I want to be honest with you that I certainly don't feel like I have all the answers to this question. With my talk today, what I hope to do is put on the table some concepts that we can wrestle with together in terms of what resilience means in the face of the planetary emergency, and how does cultural heritage intersect with this topic. Just to help orient you in my talk, let me give you the basic organization I will follow. In the first half of my talk, I'll try to provide some context. In other words, what do we mean by the term planetary emergency? What do I mean when I use the word resilience? And how are some of the ways that cultural heritage can contribute to building resilience in the face of the planetary emergency? For the second part of my talk, I'll try to give you some concrete examples of the role of cultural heritage in resilience, in building resilience in the face of the climate emergency, the planetary emergency. And for that, I'm going to, of course, come to Europe and the European Green Deal. So I'm going to talk about how cultural heritage can contribute to ecological transition for Europe in the framework of the European Green Deal. How can cultural heritage contribute to a more just, resilient, and sustainable Europe? Before I do those things, though, I just will give you a little bit more of an introduction about myself. As Sonja said, for the past couple of years, I have been the coordinator of the Climate Change and Heritage Working Group within ICOMOS. That working group, it was formed in 2017 to help support and prioritize development of ICOMOS's climate change policies and engagements. In 2020, under the leadership of our working group, ICOMOS declared a climate and ecological emergency. And I think it's important just in terms of giving you a sense of the seriousness, the gravity with which we in ICOMOS view these issues. It's an emergency. So I've had the pleasure of working with this dynamic group for 4 years now, but as Sonja said, my mandate came to an end just 2 weeks ago. And I want to just quickly mention that my successor, Dr. Will McGarry from Ireland. Will is a fantastic leader and really a visionary leader on issues of climate change and cultural heritage. And I hope that each of you, both within ICOMOS and within our partner organizations and colleagues elsewhere, will have a chance to work with Will. In addition to my work for ICOMOS, as Sonja said, I have the privilege of coordinating the Secretariat of the Climate Heritage Network. Sometimes we call this the CHN. The CHN was launched in 2019 with the goal of foregrounding the cultural dimensions of climate change, scaling up culture-based climate solutions, and mobilizing arts, culture, and heritage for climate action. It's a diverse network comprised of units of government, cultural organizations, businesses, universities, civil society. Each of your organizations would be welcome to consider joining us. You can learn more at climateheritage.org. So with that introduction, I want to move to the topic of the day, building resilience, cultural heritage, and the planetary emergency. To start with, I think it's worthwhile to give some definition to what I mean when I use the term planetary emergency. What I'm referring to here is the combination of threats which together are imperiling the well-being of human communities and of all life on Earth. These threats are the result of a series of related stresses: rapid urbanization, wealth inequality, globalization, insensitive development, and unsustainable consumption and production patterns. One of the results of these stresses, a critical threat I want to talk about today, is of course the climate emergency. Increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere caused by human activities like the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation are warming the planet, which is changing the climate and increasing the hazards that we face through risks like sea level rise and increased storminess. The situation has gotten to the point that climate change has become one of the most significant and fastest growing threats to people and their heritage worldwide. At the same time, the ecosystems that underpin our well-being are collapsing. Species are becoming extinct at an unprecedented rate. This is the second great threat that makes up the planetary emergency. That is the biodiversity crisis. And of course, we see parallels between the two, between the fate of humans and the rest of nature. They're intertwined. As we're fond of saying in ICOMOS, nature and culture are linked. At the heart of this emergency is a clash between the immediate needs of humans versus the long-term impacts on the planet's capacity to support life. Some of you will have heard about a big report released a few weeks ago by the IPCC. It stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the world's leading climate science body. The report was entitled Climate Change 2021. And in it, the IPCC shared some important information, and I want to mention some of those key points just now. First, the climate scientists reported that they have been able to observe changes in the Earth's climate in every region and across the whole climate system. The point being that climate change is a threat today, not just in the future. The IPCC in an earlier report found that we have already warmed the planet about 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial levels, so since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. The new IPCC report also found that many of the changes they have observed are unprecedented in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And lastly, and this is important, they found that some of the changes already set in motion, for example, sea level rise, are at this point irreversible, at least irreversible within the next several hundred years. So we have already changed the climate. The results of impacts are currently displacing populations and damaging communities and their cultural heritage. And so we have to plan for the climate change we have already caused. We have to adapt. But that report also found that some of the worst impacts of climate change can still be avoided. But avoiding those impacts will require deep, rapid cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. And so, and this is critically important to our topic today, we have to have a focus on greenhouse gas emission reduction. Humans, of course, we're still emitting net greenhouse gases. We're continuing to warm the planet more every day through those emissions. As Sonja said, the Paris Agreement sets out a goal for halting this trend of keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. But we're not on track to meet that goal. We need to make changes in the way we grow food, use buildings, design cities so that we emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not on track to achieve that so far. What we need is what is sometimes called transformative change. So why am I focusing on this? Transformative change, decarbonization, greenhouse gas emissions. I'm telling you this because the pace of greenhouse gas reduction is key to reducing the threats of climate change, including threats to cultural heritage. The IPCC report I mentioned a moment ago says that every additional increment of warming is of consequence. Well, 1.5 degrees of global warming will severely damage natural and cultural heritage. The impacts of 2 degrees of warming will be significantly worse. The report specifically included that heavy precipitation, rain, is projected to be higher at 2 degrees of warming than 1.5. More of global land area will be flooded at 2 degrees of warming versus 1.5. The risk of low-lying areas to sea level rise is higher at 2 degrees of warming than 1.5. So fewer greenhouse gases means less warming, which means fewer impacts, which means a greater opportunity for adaptation of communities and of heritage sites. More greenhouse gas emissions means more warming, more impacts. There's a limit to the adaptive capacity of every site, of every system. And we know that many places, many sites, many communities, many monuments will not be able to adapt their way out of the impacts caused by 3 degrees or even 2 degrees of warming. For these places, the best resilience strategy, the best adaptation strategy includes a focus on greenhouse gas mitigation so that we hold warming to 1.5 degrees and reduce impacts. Okay, so that's a little bit of the context I want to provide in terms of what I mean by the planetary emergency. The second concept I want to address in this first half of my talk is the concept of resilience. It's obviously a critical topic. It's particularly critical today as it's the title of our symposium. It looms large in the SDGs, the concept of resilience. It's important in SDG 13, which is the SDG, the UN Sustainable Development Goal on climate action. It, of course, is also a key element of SDG 11.4. This is the only UN Sustainable Development Goal that expressly mentions heritage. And what SDG 11.4 says, I think you will all know this, is that strengthening efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage can make cities and human settlements more inclusive, safe, sustainable, and resilient. So what does this word resilience mean? What does it mean specifically in the context of the planetary emergency? There's a lot of research and science on the concept of resilience, and 3 key aspects often are identified. Resilience relates to the capacity to transform. Resilience relates to the capacity to persist. And resilience relates to the capacity to adapt. Often when people are asked to summarize what does resilience mean in one sentence, the answer they give is that resilience is the ability to live with change. And so what is the role of cultural heritage in building resilience in the face of the planetary emergency? What is the change that people will need to live with, and how can we help them with that? Well, of course, there's the need to respond to the impacts of climate change, changing seasonality, changing heat, changing precipitation patterns. But please also do not forget that the transformative change we need to mitigate climate change also requires resilience. Holding warming to 1.5 degrees is going to be incredibly difficult. Not only do we need far-reaching ecological change, green transition in the way we build cities, grow food, travel, all of these things. And these changes are needed rapidly, like in this decade, because the window of opportunity to hold warming to 1.5 degrees is closing. This systems transition on a nearly unprecedented scale will be disruptive, it will be messy, it will create conflict. The cultural dimensions of these shifts will also be huge. And so this is another dimension of change which requires resilience. So we see that for purposes of discussing resilience, we're really implicating both the concept of adaptation, that is resilience in the face of the impacts of climate change we have already caused, but also mitigation, that is resilience in the face of the transformative change we need to reduce future climate change. So adaptation and mitigation both merge, in climate adaptation and climate mitigation both merge in the concept of resilience. We need resilience in the face of both. Resilient science suggests some key characteristics of resilient systems. And here we see the interlinkages of culture and the rest of nature because we find common patterns between resilient human systems and resilient natural systems. There are many ways to describe resilient systems, but I want to just highlight a few of the elements that recur, that are brought up over and over again. The first is sometimes called redundancy. It's a strange word even for a native English speaker, I could say, but what it essentially means is having a multiplicity of pathways. It means having multiple options, and it applies in a lot of different contexts, but in particular in terms of social networks, having a multitude of social networks that support you and your community. A second key aspect of resilience is diversity. Diversity of knowledge systems, diversity of livelihoods, diversity in terms of biodiversity. A third key concept, it has another kind of strange word in English at least, modularity. But what it basically means is a measure of a system's, on the one hand, interconnectedness, how interconnected is it to other systems, but on the other, how well does it function alone? And here we start to see issues of local self-sufficiency. How do we balance interconnectedness with the world with the self-sufficiency of the community? This is a third key dimension of resilience. Fourth, equity and justice, which includes how widely are capabilities and opportunities distributed within a society. And finally, adaptive learning, the ability to adapt and learn, and this starts to implicate creativity and inspiration. So the gravity of the planetary emergency invites us to begin to examine every aspect of cultural heritage practice to see if these things do indeed help us manage and deal with change. How does heritage contribute to resilience? Using the elements of resilience I just listed, we could ask ourselves, what aspects of cultural heritage promote a multiplicity of social networks? What aspects of our work promotes diversity of knowledge systems? What aspects of heritage promotes interconnectedness and intercultural dialogue on the one hand, but on the other, local self-sufficiency? How do we support equity within communities and promote adaptive learning? Hopefully in your own work, you're starting to see connections to these elements of resilience. Cultural heritage, documentary heritage, libraries, archives, traditional wisdom, traditional knowledge, heritage sites, all of these offer immense potential to support transformative action and just transitions by communities towards climate resilient futures. At the Climate Heritage Network, we sometimes say that anthropogenic problems need human solutions. And what is cultural heritage if not a great accumulation of human experience and human solutions? Guiding transformative change requires understanding how humans relate to places and things. It benefits from knowing how humans have responded to past social and environmental change. Addressing climate change calls for planning with a multi-generational time horizon, an intergenerational approach that is almost uniquely at the core of cultural heritage planning. Climate change work demands circular economy approaches that promote the reuse and conservation of resources. Tackling climate change demands knowledge, information, creativity. You could call that cultural capital. And it requires social cohesion, a shared love of place, inclusive approaches. Jelka Pirkovič mentioned a number of these, all of which are prerequisites to the common action that is needed for transformative climate action. So these are all things we're good at in cultural heritage. And so the point I'm really trying to make to you is that the things we are good at in cultural heritage are also good for climate action. What this means is that there is a climate action mission and a purpose for every cultural heritage actor. The status quo is a choice. Doing things the way we always did them is a choice. And doing things the way we've always done them is what has given us the planetary emergency. And so we need to make the choice to leave behind business as usual and engage ourselves in the transformative change that is necessary to tackle the planetary emergency. So, how do we make this shift? How do we emphasize the resilience building dimension of our work? What does this path look like? How do we increase the ambition of the cultural heritage world to contribute to the work of addressing climate change and building resilience? How do we convince others, like people in the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Climate Change, of the relevance of culture and heritage to their climate action work? How do we convince climate scientists to give a look at social science, the humanities, and cultural heritage information? What does cultural heritage look like when we reject business as usual and orient our work to be a part of the solution to climate change, to focus on building resilience for communities? So, to answer that question, here I want to shift gears and move into the second half of my talk. I want to take up the question of the European Green Deal and use some examples from the European Green Deal to try to illustrate the roles for cultural heritage in climate action and resilience building that I just referenced. And to do that, I first want to introduce you to a paper that was issued a few months ago. It's called the European Cultural Heritage Green Paper. You can find it online by searching European Cultural Heritage Green Paper. My goal here is to take the abstract concepts of resilience, diversity of knowledge systems, local self-sufficiency, and provide some concrete examples of how cultural heritage can support communities in making, achieving, and surviving ecological transition. I am going to spend less time talking about physical interventions in monuments and sites, interventions to help them adapt to more heat or sea level rise. Not because that's important, but because I think my good friend Rohit Jagasu will speak to this much more in his keynote tomorrow. Suffice to say, though, that the safeguarding, the conservation of monuments is inextricably linked to all the functions of cultural heritage and resilience that I just mentioned. That physical fabric, those attributes, it's carrying the identity, the values, the knowledge, the information, which are so key to the role of cultural heritage in resilience. And if we lose that fabric, those attributes, what will happen to the knowledge, the identity, the values that are so important? And so I think my talk and Rohit's, I hope you will find them very complementary. A little background on the European Cultural Heritage Green Paper itself. The paper was produced by Europa Nostra in cooperation with ICOMOS and the Climate Heritage Network, with the input of members of the European Heritage Alliance and the support of the European Investment Bank, Institute, and Creative Europe. Some of the key concepts in the Green Paper were developed in 2019 in the framework of the Croatian presidency of the Council of the EU. So it's a real pleasure to be able to advance this conversation today in 2021 during the Slovenian presidency. The European Green Deal itself, the plan from the European Commission, aims to chart the EU's course to net zero emissions by launching a set of policies that will transform the economy, industry, production, consumption, buildings, infrastructure, transport, food and agriculture, construction, taxation, and social benefits for Europe. It aims to address the biodiversity crisis as well as it aspires to be a new growth strategy for Europe, one where environmental, economic, and social sustainability go hand in hand. Some people think it's too ambitious. Some people think it's not ambitious enough. I think it's fair to say that it is arguably the most ambitious climate plan in the world. Despite this, despite the comprehensive nature of the European Green Deal, despite the fact that it promises to launch an all-of-society effort, as it was initially released, as originally written in 2019, the European Green Deal envisioned no role for culture or heritage at all in its transformative agenda. This discovery was a wake-up call for many of us in cultural heritage, an urgent reminder of the need to clearly articulate the cultural dimensions of transformative climate action, the role of cultural heritage in climate resilience to our colleagues in other sectors. We had done a lot of work on these topics amongst ourselves, but apparently that message didn't make it far enough. So that was a real wake-up call for us in the cultural heritage sector, our exclusion from the European Green Deal as originally written. The Green Paper was a response to that wake-up call. The Green Paper was undertaken in the spirit of cultural heritage, not as a bystander to ecological transition, to green transformation, but with the idea that we in cultural heritage are convinced actors in this process. We are convinced that the European Green Deal is fundamental, in fact, intrinsic to our work in cultural heritage. The European Green Deal puts Europe and indeed the planet on the path to holding warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, which, as I said before, is key to reducing threats, including threats to cultural heritage. This is why anyone who cares about safeguarding the planet and its cultural heritage must want the European Green Deal to succeed. At the same time, we approached the European Green Deal firm in the conviction that cultural heritage is essential to the success of the Green Deal, something that the authors of the Green Deal themselves, it seems, haven't quite yet realized. You've heard many of the reasons for this already. I mentioned some of them, Miles, Jelka mentioned some of them. Cultural heritage offers an immense potential to drive climate action, to influence consumption patterns, to support transition towards a healthier, greener, fairer society and economy. Cultural heritage can be a catalyst for positive change. It has the power to connect people to places, encourages a sense of belonging, and fosters social inclusion, which are essential to collective climate action. I would argue to you that no industrialized society, and certainly not societies in Europe, can achieve systems transition on a nearly unprecedented scale, on the radical scale contemplated by the European Green Deal, without attention to the cultural dimensions of those shifts and without capturing the hearts and minds of the residents. So what we tried to do with the European Green Deal is make these points in a positive way, readily understandable by those working in climate and environmental policy. We wrote the Green Paper about, we wrote about climate change for a culture audience, yes, but equally importantly, we were writing about culture for a climate audience. So in a moment, I want to walk through some concrete examples from the Green Deal and the role of cultural heritage in achieving the Green Deal's ambitions. But before that, I want to mention one other overarching theme of the Green Paper, and that is conflict. Or perhaps better to say, how do we minimize conflict between cultural heritage safeguarding and climate action? Because simply put, measures which are viewed in the environmental and climate change world as building resilience may actually damage cultural heritage, at least in the sense we have traditionally understood. So there's this potential for conflict between heritage safeguarding and climate action. The European Green Deal itself says that careful attention will have to be paid to potential trade-offs, is the key word, trade-offs between environmental and social objectives, trade-offs between strategies that build resilience in a certain frame of mind versus strategies that that safeguard cultural heritage, which of course itself contributes to resilience. So trade-offs. This is to be expected in an effort of this magnitude. And so we cannot be surprised that there are real and perceived tensions between climate action and any other type of activity in any sector, including conservation of heritage values. In the Green Paper, we try to be very direct about these potential tensions. We talk about wind farms in cultural landscapes, insensitive retrofitting of historic buildings for energy efficiency, the phasing out of traditional livelihoods, multi-generational livelihoods rooted in the carbon-based economy, like the cultural heritage of coal miners, and the problem of greenhouse gas intensive forms of cultural tourism. To be honest, I regret that so often the discussion of cultural heritage and climate action begins and even ends with this topic of conflict. With hundreds of positive ways cultural heritage contributes to climate action, why should that be so? Indeed, I would say in general terms, the aims of cultural heritage, rooted in circular economy, in reuse, in conservation, are inherently more aligned with green action than in almost any sector. But that doesn't mean the potential trade-offs aren't real. Maladapted climate action that impairs the co-benefits, I'm using some climate jargon here, the co-benefits associated with cultural resources, cultural rights, and heritage values can ultimately undermine environmental objectives. Advocates on all sides must seek to maximize win-win outcomes that both advance climate action, build resilience, and safeguard cultural resources. So with that introduction to the Green Paper, what I want to do now is go through a bit of a sectoral analysis. The European Green Deal itself is made up of a series of green transition plans that address many of the major sectors of European economy. The Green Paper analyzes how the core competencies of cultural heritage correlate to 9 of these: energy, circular economy, buildings and renovation, mobility and transport, food systems, green finance and just transition, research and innovation, education and training, and EU external relations, so-called Green Deal diplomacy. I don't have time to talk about all of these, but I want to highlight a few of them. And as I talk, I invite you to give thought to how you and the organizations and agencies you work with can do more to engage in the types of activities that we talk about in the Green Paper. How are the things you're good at? How is your agenda? How are your priorities intersecting with these aims? The first thing I want to talk about is energy, which may sound like a funny thing to be talking about in a cultural heritage meeting, but please bear with me. The Green Paper begins with energy because the Green Deal begins with energy, with supplying clean, affordable, and secure energy. The production and use of energy accounts for more than 75% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions. These are the emissions that are causing seas to rise, storms to be worse, precipitation patterns to change. Decarbonizing the energy system is thus crucial to achieving climate neutrality by 2050 and mitigating the impacts of climate change. The Green Paper lays out the constructive role that cultural heritage can play in green transition for Europe's energy systems. Perhaps the most critical thing here is that the EU's new strategy for energy system integration puts energy efficiency first. So before we talk about how to make more green energy, let's talk about all of us using less energy in the first place. Now, why is this critical for us in this heritage meeting? It's because energy efficiency reduces the need for energy infrastructure. Very literally, more efficiency can mean fewer wind farms, fewer transmission corridors, and thus less impact on biodiversity and cultural resources. Achieving energy efficiency is a path to win-win outcomes, and supporting energy efficiency goals should be a cultural heritage priority. How? We can start by taking every opportunity in the messaging of our ministries of culture, our UNESCO commissions, our cultural heritage organizations, our universities, to connect the Green Deal and its energy efficiency aims to the ethic of reuse of resources, conservation, and stewardship on which cultural heritage is based. And of course, we can fully electrify and improve the efficiency of the historic built environment. Even with greater efficiency, the transition to climate neutrality for Europe will still require additional renewable energy infrastructure. This can and should be attained while also protecting biodiversity and heritage. At the EU level, a new platform is urgently needed to stimulate a constructive dialogue between heritage bodies and the renewables industry. Increasing the capacity of heritage authorities to proactively participate in the design and siting of wind farms and other renewable energy infrastructure will help. These measures would ultimately expedite and improve the siting of energy infrastructure in ways that minimize negative impacts. Cultural heritage can help increase the supply of green power in other ways. For example, by emphasizing the traditional knowledge associated with community scale hydro and geothermal, and by helping every historic district in Europe to become a positive energy district. So these things I'm saying, I don't know, do they sound strange to you? Are you surprised that I'm making these points in a heritage meeting? I'm talking about the electrification of old buildings, traditional knowledge about hydropower, how to site wind turbines. But these are the steps that are required to respond to change. These are the steps that build local self-sufficiency, that create multiple systems, that reduce greenhouse gases and thus reduce climate impacts, that support biodiversity. This is resilience. This is what resilience means in the face of the planetary emergency. And the points I'm making are some of the ways that cultural heritage builds resilience. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip and just talk about two more areas. I normally would talk a lot about buildings in this discussion, how to improve the energy performance of buildings, how to make strategies that do that while respecting their heritage values. I think this will come up other times in this conference. I just want to note that I do think overwhelmingly there are a lot of strategies that allow for improving the energy efficiency of historic buildings while safeguarding their values. I think many historic buildings already have inherently sustainable features that simply need to be valued. So I think there are a lot of win-wins in this context. I might also mention that the key EU policy, the Green Deal policy on this topic, called the renovation wave, envisions massive millions and millions of buildings retrofitted for energy efficiency, existing buildings in Europe. So one question is about skills and knowledge. Do we have the number of skilled tradespeople? Do we have the number of carpenters that can assist in sensitively retrofitting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of older buildings in Europe? So this, I think, is another priority for our sector. And the last thing I want to say is that the renovation wave, which, as I mentioned, is the Green Deal's main chapter on the built environment, it really is silent on the co-benefits of the built environment. It doesn't really address how benefits for society beyond energy efficiency can be achieved while retrofitting existing buildings for energy efficiency. So this is sort of a gap. And the cultural heritage sector can be of enormous help here, suggesting participatory and neighborhood-based approaches to renovation that also deliver co-benefits like social cohesion, well-being, creativity, tourism, and intercultural dialogue. And let us also not forget how traditional building knowledge can help adapt buildings to climate change impacts. Because while we're worrying about the energy footprint of buildings, we also have to worry about how they perform in the face of increasing heat, of more rain. And traditional knowledge has a lot to say about that. I could also mention the agriculture policy, where I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to contribute to resilience through traditional European agricultural knowledge and craft know-how, helping to sustainably decarbonize food production in Europe. Other points, traditional diets and their role in the green transition. But for my final topic in the last minutes of my talk, I want to skip to the topic of just transition. So just transition, it's a term of art. It's a buzzword in climate policy. Europe's green transition must be just and inclusive it has to pay attention to the regions and industries and workers who will face the greatest challenges. The cornerstone of these efforts in the European Green Deal is the EU's new Just Transition mechanism. And in my opinion, this is an area where cultural heritage can play an extremely important role, including culture, heritage, creative industries, craft, and the knowledge of local communities in just transition measures will help assure community-led processes, wider acceptance of change, and more durable and effective outcomes. So as we ask communities dependent on coal mining to cease engaging in coal mining, as we ask communities dependent on greenhouse gas intensive tourism to diversify and have less tourism, or at least less greenhouse gas intensive tourism, what role can cultural heritage play in these transitions, in supporting communities as they make them, and in addressing the conflict and controversy that will inevitably accompany such dramatic changes? The Council of Europe's Faro Convention can be used to root just transition planning in the European values of cultural diversity, human rights, and participatory democracy. Craft and heritage trades can aid in reskilling, just to give a few examples. We see this in Ireland, for example, where peat bogs have played a historic role in the Irish economy and culture, and where cultural heritage-based strategies are now being used to help achieve a just transition for peat-reliant regions amidst a phase out of peat and peat cutting as a part of greening the energy sector. So here we have a cultural tradition of peat cutting, cutting the sod to make energy. It's incredibly destructive in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and it is being phased out across the world. So what is the cultural heritage response to a cultural tradition, a multi-generational tradition like peat cutting being discontinued? It has not been to push against that. It has not been to insist that communities continue to be powered by peat. Rather, it has been to document and memorialize the customs and traditions of peat cutting, to take the stories of the families and the workers involved in peat cutting, to valorize their contributions to the tradition, trajectory of success of their communities. They helped power their communities for centuries, to valorize that and celebrate it, even while we use cultural heritage-based strategies to diversify economies in those local communities as peat cutters move to other occupations. And so this is what I'm talking about tensions and conflict between climate action and cultural heritage safeguarding, and looking for the win-wins. Every cultural heritage organization and institution in Europe can and should play a role in securing a just ecological transition. And I think the connection between a just transition and resilient communities should be evident. And so in this little survey I have given you of the European Green Deal and the role of cultural heritage, what I've tried to make clear is that in the face of rapid and far-reaching ecological transition, coupled with growing impacts from climate like extreme weather, resilience becomes very multifaceted. Helping communities decarbonize, helping communities deal with the measures to achieve decarbonization, helping communities deal with climate impacts like rain and sea level rise. These things are all bound together in the environmental emergency. And the role of cultural heritage in supporting resilience in the face of these is equally multidimensional. And so just in conclusion, I mentioned before that last year, the ICOMOS Triennial General Assembly voted to declare a climate and ecological emergency. It called upon other culture and heritage organizations to do the same. You can find the text of that resolution online, and your organization might consider this approach. In the context of that declaration of emergency, the ICOMOS General Assembly called upon the cultural heritage community to implement heritage responses to climate change that seek to realize the potential of cultural heritage, including both tangible and intangible heritage, and local communities' knowledge and practices, to contribute to transformative change, to help drive greenhouse gas reduction, support climate adaptation, and deliver climate resilient development pathways that also strengthen sustainable development. Yes, we want to live through climate change. We want to endure ecological transition, but is it possible for us to thrive? Can these things help make our communities more prosperous? Can they help us thrive? And that's what we mean by climate resilient sustainable development. The Future of Our Past report that Sonja mentioned supports this work by outlining ways in which the cultural heritage community can address both the causes of climate change and its effects. That document is a global document. The European Cultural Heritage Green Paper then tailors those concepts to the European context. They provide a benchmark against which heritage actors and operators can measure their own engagement with the planetary emergency. In the foreword to The Future of Our Past, the past president of ICOMOS, Toshiyuki Kono, wrote the following: "It would be foolish to imagine the practice of heritage remaining static while the world goes through the rapid and far-reaching transitions discussed in the IPCC's recent special report. Responding requires adjustments in the aims and methodologies of heritage practice. Achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, on the other hand, requires dismantling the barriers to the full recognition of the cultural dimensions of climate action. We in cultural heritage need to do a better job of taking on board the imperatives of the climate emergency, and those in the climate action environmental world need to do a better job in recognizing the cultural dimensions of their work." According to the 2020 UN Environment Emissions Gap Report, the world is on course today, not for just 1.5 degrees of warming, not for 2 degrees of warming, but for 3 degrees of global warming. The results of 3 degrees of global warming is catastrophic. The effects are catastrophic. There is no Venice at 3 degrees of global warming. Sites can't adapt to 3 degrees of global warming. We cannot allow the world to warm 3 degrees. So much work has already been done to tackle the climate emergency. The planet, the people of the planet have been working on the climate change problem for 30, 40 years now. And yet we're going in the wrong direction still. What haven't we tried? Who has been missing from the climate action team? Who is not at the table of designing climate action plans? Culture and heritage. We've been missing, or at least not fully tapped. Our skills are useful. We have a lot to contribute to climate action and to building a resilient future for the world. Let us in cultural heritage make holding global warming to below 1.5 degrees an explicit goal of our work. Let us demand a seat at the climate action table. When it comes to building resilience and tackling the climate emergency, I hope that we can all agree the world should count the cultural heritage sector in. And with that, I thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I thank ICOMOS Slovenia and partners for shining a light on this critical issue, and I wish you good discussions in the balance of your conference. Thank you.
Dear Andrew, many thanks for this excellent and very inspiring speech. I think we have to hear this on, and also our politicians have to hear that on and on. Of course, now discussion is open. I invite all of you on Zoom to raise the hands and ask the questions, or write in chat your questions. And of course, audience here at the Faculty of Architecture in Ljubljana, you can ask from your seats. Speakers are strong enough that Andrew will hear you. So, do we have any questions already? If not, I would start. Andrew, you've been part of the preparation of Rome Declaration last month, or at the end of July, where politicians, cultural ministers of the group G20 prepared a declaration on cultural heritage, or on actual importance of the culture for the future of world, not just Europe. Could you comment how they understand our actions related to the climate changes and heritage? Do they see the cultural heritage sector, which is not loud enough, as you said, or was not didn't participate enough in all these climate actions in recent years? Could you tell us something more about their awareness of us as the heritage community?
Yes, Sonja, thank you for the question. So maybe people in the audience will know about the G20. It's an organization of the 20 largest economies in the world, the nations with the 20 largest economies in the world. France is a member, Germany, Italy, and then also the European Union is a member of the G20. And the G20 nations, also Saudi Arabia, also China, also the United States, also Brazil, for example. The G20 nations are critical to thinking about the climate emergency because collectively, the nations of the G20 are responsible for over 75% of all greenhouse gas emissions. You know, it's not a secret that only a few countries in the world are primarily responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change. And there are many other parts of the world where the residents are not contributing very much in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but they are on the front lines of the heat and sea level rise and storms that climate change is causing. So this is the climate injustice, the climate justice crisis. But to answer your question about the G20, for 2021, the presidency of the G20 was held by Italy. And for the first time in history, Italy decided to convene a meeting of the ministers of culture of all the G20 countries. There had been talks about culture at previous G20 meetings, but never a ministerial level event. And this ministerial event was held, as Sonja said, at the end of July in Rome. And the Italian presidency decided to have the ministers focus on 3 themes. And one of those themes was how culture can be part of the solution to climate change. So already this was extraordinary. And I salute the Italian government for their leadership on this issue, for elevating culture within the G20, and then for elevating climate change among culture ministers. I will note that in the parallel meetings of environmental ministers and ecology ministers and climate change ministers, there was almost no discussion of cultural heritage. So our job is not done in terms of explaining our role to our colleagues in environment and energy. But at least in the culture sector itself, we are fulfilling our duty and talking about climate change. And there was an outcome of this ministerial, the Rome Declaration. And the Rome Declaration has a number of valuable points, and I would encourage you to find it text on the web. First of all, it acknowledges that cultural heritage has not been well represented in climate change planning and policy making. And just having this frank statement of truth, of reality, made by the ministers, I think is valuable, because this has been not emphasized enough. And then the ministers also agreed to do something very important. They agreed to do what they can in their home countries to get cultural topics added to their national climate plans, specifically to their national climate adaptation and resilience plans. And so these are ministers of culture who are promising, and maybe promise is too strong a word, who are talking about going home and working with their ministries of ecology and environment and climate to get culture better represented in climate planning. And this is crucial because culture is missing from many, many climate plans. We have some breakthroughs now. The National Climate Adaptation Framework for Ireland, for the Republic of Ireland, now includes a dedicated chapter on built and archaeological heritage. But most climate action plans at the national, regional, and local levels ignore culture. And so this commitment by G20 ministries of culture is very, very valuable. And now I think it's up to us in civil society and other sectors to try to help our colleagues in government and the ministries to realize this potential. But having this commitment is very valuable, I think. And by the way, these accomplishments at the G20, as well as other recent developments regarding climate change and cultural heritage, are going to be discussed at the 2021 UN Climate Conference called COP26, which will be held in Glasgow, UK in November. So these are the global United Nations organized climate meetings. And again, culture has been under-discussed in these meetings, but because of a variety of initiatives, we hope that cultural heritage voices, arts, culture, and heritage voices will be more prominent at the 2021 COP26.
I think that's very important, actually, and that things are somehow moving forward, and that we are getting the visibility. We have the questions now, 2 raised hands. Spila Spangil. Spila, would you ask by yourself question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you, Mr. Andrew Potts, for this inspiring presentation. I had a pleasure hearing your interventions in the Council of Europe. That was very well received. And the presentation on the future of the past in the framework of one of the World Heritage Committee sessions. I don't remember which one. I think it was in Baku, but never mind. I think that the issue at stake, it's rather clear. And I think that many of the experts and the government really take it very, very seriously. If I may only mention the discussion on the updated policy on the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties that took place maybe 2 months ago. I think it was very clear for the government, or at least for the experts and in the delegations that we were contributing to this meeting, that climate change is one of the factors that impact our cultural and natural heritage. And natural, it is the first place, actually, the first impact. And this message from IUCN and ICOMOS was extremely clear. Of course, in the discussion that followed this, as you know, this is a policy and a political discussion as well. There was a lot of talk about the responsibilities and this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, which will get us into trouble eventually, as I could just see. But I would maybe go from the EU, from the UN and UNESCO framework, maybe on to the EU level, and I will briefly explain why. We were awaiting impatiently for the State of the Union speech that was delivered yesterday by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Of course, we were waiting for the climate change or climate crisis, as she also called it, to be discussed, and we were also waiting for the Green Deal to be mentioned in her speech. And even narrower, we were waiting for the new European Bauhaus to be mentioned and to be put into the context. And here, where my question, from where my question arises, is that we've been obviously very, very following with great detail on the new European Bauhaus movement. And here we also miss cultural heritage, if I may be very direct. It was a lot about creativity, about co-creation, about the engineering, about the designers, architects, and so on. And this is where we think that also cultural heritage has an immense potential to contribute. So, of course, being in the position of holding the EU presidency, we will do our part in mobilizing that this message gets through. But I would just like to ask you, maybe on your thoughts, why there is still such a gap between cultural heritage and culture field, so to speak, and why we need to really step up and why we need to really articulate our voices to be heard. Because this is not something that is obvious in every country of the EU or maybe Europe beyond. They take the environment more in a package, so there is no need to fight for cultural heritage, for natural values and so on, but they see this package as one. But most of the countries, I think that we are still struggling in delivering that, and the message on the EU level, formally speaking, is somehow diluted in that way. So I would be really curious to hear your thoughts on that, because you were so engaged in the Green Deal and the whole, you probably also have some background to share with us if possible. So thank you very much again.
Well, Spela, thank you. There were so many good points there, and I agree with everything that you said. I mean, just quickly to flag the observation you made about the World Heritage Program, there is in the works a new international policy from the World Heritage Committee, from UNESCO, on climate action for World Heritage. The World Heritage Program does have a climate change policy, but it's now almost 15 years old. So this updates it in the framework of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. I encourage you to look at the draft that's currently available. In my opinion, it's a good draft. I did play some small role in its preparation, but one of the very interesting things it emphasizes is the need for a precautionary approach. What does it mean? It means one of the best ways, in fact, it says this, to safeguard cultural heritage is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So again, making this point that we can't adapt to 3 degrees of warming. We need to avoid 3 degrees of warming. And it talks about that. It talks about what does it mean to safeguard outstanding universal value amidst climate impacts and transformative change, and a variety of other points. That policy is not adopted yet. It was endorsed by the World Heritage Committee, but it will go before the General Assembly of the World Heritage Convention in November. So that will be a big development. You also asked the question more kind of fundamentally, we could even say culturally. Why do heritage concepts, cultural heritage actors not get better taken on board in climate action? And we could probably ask the reverse question, why do cultural heritage actors not engage more with the climate emergency? There's actually some research on this topic, and it suggests that climate planning, climate action, it's very much rooted in quantitative analysis, in counting greenhouse gas molecules and in other data, and that cultural heritage work is more qualitative. And this discrepancy or this difference, it inhibits the integration of the two. It's a theory that exists. I do think we're quite attuned to threats to cultural heritage, and I alluded to this in my remarks, so that our first response to the climate emergency is to be worried about how specific climate actions, like a wind farm, can adversely impact cultural resources. And it's our job to safeguard those cultural resources. So we focus on that. And it can cause us to miss the big picture that there's going to be a bigger impact to cultural resources from sea level rise, from intense heat, from flooding, than from wind farms. And it's not to say wind farms don't need to be better sited, but we need to keep the big picture of how do we safeguard cultural heritage. So I don't know, a few thoughts for me, but then to conclude, you mentioned the new European Bauhaus, and I'm glad you did. I didn't have time in the body of my remarks, but it's so important. In 2019, I already mentioned that when the European Green Deal was released, it didn't mention culture or heritage at all. And later, though, the European Commission announced the new European Bauhaus. And the goal of this program is to drive sustainable design across Europe. And in its release, it was specifically said that the purpose of the new European Bauhaus is to connect the European Green Deal to culture. But it's still a bit unclear about how the new European Bauhaus will do this. The link to industrial design is very clear. the link to sort of design innovation is clear. But in my own personal opinion, still too much of a focus on novelty in terms of innovation and design, not a recognition that innovation can come from harnessing traditional knowledge, from accumulated wisdom for new uses and new values. And so innovation is not just about novelty. And how this will get incorporated into the new Bauhaus, I think, is a question. To me, Baukultur, the European tradition of Baukultur, would have been a very obvious core element of the new Bauhaus initiative. And initially it wasn't, but inserting that in there, I think, is a way to improve the new European Bauhaus idea. And then just more generally, bringing into it a concern for the historic character of Europe's cities and villages and rural areas, the design of those places, of these traditional designs, and realizing that in the design of the new European Bauhaus would improve it, in my own opinion.
Spela. I know that also ICOMOS is engaged now even more. I don't know if Rin is still with us. She could tell something more about that. But New European Bauhaus should somehow be more connected to the heritage aspect of our culture, for sure. And I hope that ICOMOS will have opportunity to do that too. So now I would ask Jelka Pirkovič. Jelka was already with us. She raised the hand. Jelka?
Yes. Do you hear me now? Yes. Well, let me start at the end of the discussion between Spela and Andrew. Indeed, New European Bauhaus is a topic that is going to be at the table of Slovenian presidency council conclusions, and we do our best really to put in the spotlight also the cultural dimension and the heritage dimension of this initiative. Because without this, I'm sure that the whole initiative is going to miss the point. But to address directly the question of climate change and cultural heritage, I must say that at the national levels, at least in my country, we succeeded this year to include heritage and cultural issues also into our national strategy, which is valid for the long-term period up to 2050 even. So I hope that this will help also not only the heritage issues related to climate change in my country, but also to have an impact through our role in OMC group and the European level as a good example how we can tackle these problems. I also want to add additional information on other questions that are at the in the discussion at the EU level. For example, the Conference of the Future of Europe, which is something that will direct our future way of life and possibilities for development in European Union. Here, culture also is not very well represented, and we fight for this possibility that heritage and culture have their voice in these strategic discussions as well. So this is only one example to show how difficult it is that heritage is understood as an important basis for our future position. And my appeal goes to all of us that we do our best in all possible ways to achieve this common goal. Thank you.
Jelka.
And maybe I say just quickly that I was aware of the efforts to mainstream cultural heritage into climate action planning at a national level in Slovenia, but I didn't know if it had reached a conclusion, and it sounds like that was achieved. And so bravo to Slovenia, and now that hopefully your good work can be a model for other countries to do the same, even while you have to go now to the next step of implementing the provisions that you got included. So bravo.
Thank you, Andrew. We have one more hand raised. Hink Pashnyak. Hink, are you still with us? No?
Yeah. I'm with you.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Andrew, for the excellent presentation. I'm connected to the International Scientific Committee of ICOMOS on water, and I have two questions. One is, but it may be a little bit early, what are the activities in connection with climate change and adaptation in ICOMOS Slovenia at country level? And secondly, and that's also a question to Andrew, we are taking a sectoral approach and actually linking up to sector institutions at all levels, national, international, and even global, to the UN Water Decade in 2023. So yeah, these are my 2 points. What is the activities of ICOMOS Slovenia on climate change? And the second is linking up to sectoral institutions.
Yeah, well, I can say something briefly about the second half of your question, and then maybe I ask Sonja and her colleagues to speak to the first part. But as to the second half, I very much commend the ICOMOS Water Committee on the cross-cutting work that it has done. So within the cultural heritage field as a sector, as an institution, yes, we need to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. The emissions at the visitor center at a World Heritage Site should be energy efficient. Cultural festivals should use local food and reduce their reliance on plastic. Libraries should use energy efficient light bulbs, for sure. I mean, I didn't emphasize this because to me it's so obvious, but yes, we need to tackle climate action in our administration of our own offices, sites, and facilities. But the remit of cultural heritage is so much broader. I try to illustrate that. Cultural heritage can contribute to resilience and decarbonization in water, in agriculture, in mobility, in buildings, in energy. Culture is transversal across all of them. The problem is there have been so many silos, and sometimes cultural voices, we don't contribute our perspective to work for, say, agriculture or energy, and we don't have connections to those ministries and those NGOs. And Hank, I think the Water Committee has really been exemplary in terms of talking about water within culture sector, but also talking about culture within the water sector, and going to the World Water Council and going to the International Drainage Commission and going to the other international bodies of water to talk about the role of culture in resilience and ecological transition and climate action in those contexts. And so I think it's essential, and I think you guys have been a model of that. So thank you.
Try to answer the first part of the question, or the first question. Actually, last year, ICOMOS Slovenia wrote the open letter to the Ministry of Environment, which prepared the draft outline of the strategy for the climate action until Slovenian climate action activities until 2050. And I think that with this, our letter, of course, at least to some extent, we contributed to what Jelka mentioned before, and for what actually Ministry of Culture and Institute for the Heritage Protection are mostly worked for, so that we have mentioned, and not just mentioned, but I think even very well introduced and presented aspect of cultural heritage in our climate strategy until 2050. This is something what we've done. This was the small action. We are also the part of the observing, or we were observers actually in 2 projects. One of them is Cheers, which will be presented tomorrow, about the World Heritage and the climate actions and the resilience of the heritage. And of course, there are many new actions. We should be more involved. One of them is the present symposium, and I think we will also future connect with the Henk and their scientific committee due to the problems of Škocjanske jame, World Heritage Site, and the proposed project for on the rivers nearby. So that is something what we've done. Okay, Henk, any comment from your side too? If not, I would ask Roko Žarnić from our audience. Professor Žarnić, please.
Yes, Andrew, thank you very much for a very elaborated and wide spectrum of problems with cultural heritage and environment. I very much enjoyed this. I have some experience. 10 years ago, I was the Minister of Environment and Spatial Planning in Slovenia, and I tried to put on agenda issue of heritage and environment because I'm working 30 years in research without success. I remember discussion in COP in Cancun when we tried to do that, but without success. But it's not all lost. You mentioned 2 very important things: inclusive growth and 20 countries which are actually holding the majority of economy and political power in the world. But one thing which you probably know, what can be a driver for success? Every of that countries, and Slovenia is not there, we are the members of OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We are paying our fees there, we are using the services, but OECD, as far as I know, is not involved in heritage issues. Also, they're the leading organization behind the inclusive growth economy. So, and also another thing, OECD is actually technically behind those 20 countries, but also behind the G7 countries. Maybe here I would ask Jelka to approach the Slovenian ambassador in OECD, because every country member has an ambassador in OECD, to open the question. And also other countries to approach their ambassadors to put on the table, on the agenda, issue of cultural heritage and environment, as you very well described the need and everybody today. And I think that can be very useful. Okay, what is your opinion?
Hello. Okay. I think that this topic is really important. I invite you, dear Roko, that we do it together in next few days or weeks to elaborate how also OECD can be included in our mission. Thank you.
Comments from you, Andrew?
Well, maybe just maybe just to reiterate that I do think I'm biased because I was involved in its preparation, but I think the green paper takes a good strategy, which is that rather than starting from the framework of cultural heritage, so in other words, heritage typologies like intangible or archaeology or built heritage, or other cultural policy frameworks. In this case, we tried to start with the framework of climate action and the framework of the Green Deal in the case of the Green Paper, but also the Paris Agreement. And ICOMOS's work, we've tried to correlate our work in cultural heritage to the sections of the Paris Agreement. How can we in cultural heritage help advance the goals under Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, which is climate adaptation, or the articles on decarbonization. And so I think if we present our activities in this way, it makes it more understandable to the climate and ecology and sustainable development and economy colleagues. And so I think the more that we can do that in diverse forums, including the OECD and UN bodies, and certainly at ministries and even local government, I think the more our value will be understood by those colleagues.
Thank you, Andrew. Any comments, Ruko? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Especially also to Jelka.
Yes, so somehow we came to the end of our today's meeting, our first day of our symposium. I would thank you all to be with us, especially Andrew. Thanks again for this excellent presentation, for the excellent approach to present all that very complex issues to all of us. I hope we will be in touch, of course, in future, also through the working group, Heritage and Climate Changes. And regarding the symposium, dear colleagues, we will meet tomorrow at 9:30 on the first session, first topic, which will be led by Rohit Yasu. Here is also the book of abstract we just published. You can all get it online, and there are also a few copies if somebody would like to let us know, and we will send it to you. So thank you all for today, and see you tomorrow, 9:30.